Hello everyone, and welcome to today's London Speaker Bureau webinar. We hope you're all safe and well, and thank you for taking the time to join. We are delighted and honoured to hear from Maryam Nemazee and Yanis Varoufakis about a wide variety of topics today, including thoughts on what economies will look like following the current crisis. And we've also made some time again for some Q&As towards the end of the webinar. Yanis Varoufakis is the former Finance Minister of Greece, Professor of Economics at the University of Athens, the co-founder of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, Secretary of the European Realistic Disobedience Front, and current Member of Parliament. He'll be speaking with journalist Maryam Nemazee. As always, please feel free to use the Q&A option, which you can access at the bottom of the screen, to send questions to our panelists. And with that, I will pass it over to Maryam and Yanis. Maryam and Yanis, thank you very much.
Yes, hello, welcome everyone. Yanis, it's great to be able to pick your brain today. I mean, I think it goes without saying that the pandemic has had an unprecedented impact on the global economy, but I find that it's all too easy to throw phrases like that around. It's quite difficult actually to really describe what's happening right now, except to say that it feels like we're in the midst of a social, cultural, economic, possibly a political earthquake as well, because what started out as a public health emergency has really become a new way of life for us all. So I guess we just wanted to touch on the impact that it's had on businesses and individuals, what the recovery might look like, or if there'll be a prolonged recession, and then if there will be lasting economic damage or permanent change from all of this. But first of all, Yanis, I just wanted to know what it's been like there in Greece and how you've been coping with life in lockdown.
Well, thank you, Maryam. It's very good to be speaking with you. I'm one of the privileged ones. There is an army of workers out there making sure that people like us, or me, can be in lockdown and can enjoy all the technological advances. But the people in supermarkets, people working the garbage trucks, the supply chains, they've had it tough. Especially in this country, even though we've been relatively untouched by the coronavirus. We had very few deaths and very few incidents of coronavirus, and we had an early lockdown. We are going to have the largest number of people who go hungry at the end of the day, because Greece has been in a Great Depression for 10 years, and the wafer-thin margins of small businesses, the hand-to-mouth existence of millions of people. Well, those were circumstances that do not augur well for a lockdown period. But the global economy, I have to say, moving beyond Greece, this is very important to remember before we start assessing the situation. It was not in a good shape before the virus hit us. The last 10 years after 2008 have been a period of remarkable conflict and contrast between, on the one hand, the world of money, which was refloated very efficiently by central banks, and the real world where real people, live and work and suffer, and where investment has never been lower in relation to available liquidity. And that was before the coronavirus hit.
I'm curious what you say about Greece, because we've seen this divergence just within Europe and all around the world, I suppose, in the way countries have approached the crisis. And one thing we have seen are eye-watering sums of stimulus and packages that are aimed at, I suppose, alleviating the damage from all of this. As you say, Greece has actually been quite impressive in the way it's managed to contain the virus, but the economy is expected to shrink, unemployment rise, much as we're anticipating everywhere else. You're mentioning those key workers and how the role they have played. Are things about to get a lot worse for them? Does more economic ruin lie ahead for Greece?
I very, very much fear so, because you have to remember that Greece is not a sovereign country, financially speaking, economically speaking, fiscally. We are, in a sense, a debtor's prison. We have an unsustainable debt, both at the public and private level. We have a government that is constrained by the lenders, the so-called troika, to run a very large, unsustainably large budget surplus, primary budget surplus, until 2060. That has never happened in any economy before in the history of capitalism. What's going to happen, of course, is that instead of a primary surplus next year, we're going to have a massive primary deficit. Now, in a country like the United Kingdom, that's fine, because you have the Bank of England monetizing the deficit, as it should, during a period when public debt must rise in order to compensate for the loss of private incomes. In Greece, we don't have a central bank to back the state. Instead, we have lenders who will descend upon Athens next year, around March, April. This is the normal process in the European Union, and particularly the Eurozone. And they will say, okay, folks, we see you have a primary deficit of minus 15% of GDP, because this is my estimation. You were supposed to have a plus 3.5% surplus. We are going to be flexible. We're going
Yanis, can I ask you, sorry to interrupt, just wanted to get to quite a few other things, if we could, but with Europe, I mean, France and Germany have proposed this 500 billion euro fund to help the countries that have been hardest hit by the virus. Now, obviously, it's far from a done deal, but even with its flaws and its imperfections, could it be something of a breakthrough if all the member states vote in favor of it?
No. Big, flat, straightforward, huge, neon lit, no. I've read the 6 pages.
That's the short answer.
I read the 6 pages of the Merkel-Macron announcement. Besides the fact that it is not a done deal, as you said, it's something that's going to be hotly contested by the governments of Austria, Holland, the frugal so-called Austrian countries. Even if it goes through exactly as stated by Chancellor Merkel and President Macron, you see in that proposal that a lot of it concerns the competitiveness of French and German industry. So a large chunk of that money is going to be diverted to battery technologies in Germany and in France, towards building up the so-called European Union champions. So a large chunk of that money is meant for the richer countries to begin with. If you want to find out how much will this fund help countries like Italy, right? I mean, forget Greece for a moment. From that 500 billion, you will have to deduct anything that comes in the form of loans, because loans do not help with bankruptcies, as we know. Anything that is not spent in the first 3 years is again irrelevant in terms of helping with the post-COVID-19 recovery. And then you have to subtract from that Italy's, Greece's, Spain's own long-term contribution to the fund, which comes in the form of increased payments into the European Union budget. What is left is the net benefit. And this is going to pale into utter insignificance compared to what will happen next March. What I was saying before, because next March, Brussels will come to Rome, they will come to Madrid, they will come to Athens and say, you need to reduce your budget deficit today.
But do you think that maybe that the proposal that we have now is likely to change and evolve when you look at the scale of the challenge now facing the Eurozone? Is some form of burden sharing not inevitable? Chancellor Merkel saying this is the biggest challenge they've ever faced. She will not want to go down in history as the leader that allowed it all to fall apart.
But she will. She will go down in history, not necessarily, I hope not as the leader that allowed everything to fall apart, but as a leader who wasted immense political capital and a decade-long Euro crisis. She wasted it utterly. In that direction. Do I expect this package to evolve? Yes, I do, but in the wrong direction. Let me be precise. Merkel and Macron's great breakthrough was that 500 billion, to the extent that it materializes, should come in the form of transfers, not in the form of loans, which is a good thing. Watch this space. By the time it goes through the European Union Council, a significant percentage of that is going to shift from transfers to loans. In other words, becoming macroeconomically insignificant, because at the moment, when you have a bankruptcy problem, as I said before, loans do not help the bankrupt.
So is it going to be, this is something it was important during the 2008 financial crisis, but actually perhaps what we're facing now means that that's not the best frame of reference at the moment. Is it going to become even more important to have control of your own currency?
Well, look, if this would be a wonderful conversation to have in 1992. Was the euro a good idea? The problem, however, is that once you've constructed it, the conversation, should we have it, is irrelevant because you have it. And the conversation you should be having is, what do we do now that we have it? So given that we don't have monetary sovereignty, what's the best plan? To disintegrate the Eurozone would bring untold hardship upon the majority of people who are involved in this disintegration. So we should try to fix the monetary union that we have. The disintegration is going to take place not because somebody is going to decide that they want to get out of the euro. This is not going to be a Brexit moment. Brexit was a well-planned and well-considered campaign that has gone on for years before it materialized in the 2016 referendum. If the Eurozone breaks down, it will break down overnight, and it will break down as a result of its fragility and the fact that even though nobody may have wanted it to break down, Italy may, for instance, find it impossible to service its debt. At some point, there will be a capital flight. Overnight, there will be capital controls to prevent it. Before anybody realizes it, Italian banks will be going bankrupt, so the Italian government will have to issue liquidity, and suddenly you have a parallel currency, even though nobody actually planned it. So a system that, this is something we learned from the Soviet Union, isn't it? A system that is unsustainable economically, which is being sustained for a very, very long time through political will and authoritarianism,
well,
when it crumbles, it crumbles very fast.
You mentioned Brexit, and I know you spent you were living here in the UK as a student some time ago. So I'd really like to get your thoughts on where you see things going. But there is actually also a question here that I want to ask from Halina Zavoritnia, who wants to ask you your thoughts on Ukraine and what measures you'd advise the government there in terms of supporting its economy to overcome the impact of the pandemic, given its trade relations with foreign partners are mostly weakened under Russian pressure.
I don't see how that connects to Brexit, but
no. It's a question that I'll come back. I'll come back to the UK side of things. But
right.
What do you think of the Ukraine's position in all of this and how it could impact their trade and economy and the sort of measures that the government might implement to stem the impact of the pandemic?
The problem that every country has, which is in a precarious position like the Ukraine is, caught between two superpowers, Russia on the one hand and the European Union on the other, this problem needs to be addressed in two ways. Firstly, to try to minimize the number of bankruptcies within Ukraine. And the only way to minimize bankruptcies in the Ukraine is to actually write off the liabilities of small companies, small and medium-sized companies in the Ukraine. Do not give them loans. Loans don't help the bankrupt. Write off tax liabilities, for instance. Write off liabilities of a number of, in terms of loans that have been taken up in the past. That's domestically. And internationally, try to limit the amount of dependence on foreign denominated public debt, because this is the time to move away from austerity domestically, but not indulge in largesse from a perspective of foreign loans in, that are euro or dollar denominated.
Now, going back to the UK, we have, obviously terrible unemployment and economic turmoil in the 80s. And now there are suggestions that unemployment could be as high as 10% this year, maybe even higher, figures that we haven't seen for a long time, I think since 1992. What is your expectation? Do you think that these warnings that the country could enter its worst recession for 300 years, is that overplayed?
No, it's not overplayed, but that's not just a UK predicament. It's a global predicament. Look at India. The latest forecast for unemployment in India is mind-boggling, and for the recession in India, for the United States, we had 36 million Americans losing their jobs within 4 weeks. So we need to put everything into perspective. Britain is relatively well placed compared to the Eurozone, for instance, because, as I said before, the British government has, the British Treasury has the Bank of England to rely upon. Already we saw yesterday that gilts sold at negative interest rates, which means that the British government, for the time being at least, has the backing of the financial markets in its attempt to invest itself out of recession.
But that's not sustainable, is it? It's a question over how long we can keep doing that for.
Well, I think it is sustainable. I think it is sustainable. Don't forget that when you've got excess capacity, when you've got idle factories, when you have idle shops that could be, or factories that could be producing a lot more than they are, and what is impeding that increase is lack of demand, to just pump money into the economy through monetary financing by the central bank is a very good idea. A very good idea, because inflation only hits you and your currency starts suffering only when you start reaching your capacity. But by that time, you can stop the monetary financing. So it doesn't have to be a very long-term project. What is essential is to prevent the bankruptcy of these factories, the closure of those factories, because if they close down, then it is very difficult to start them again.
So just a quick reminder to people watching that you can send your questions through to Yanis. I have plenty of questions to ask him, but it would be great to hear from you as well. And I get the questions through here, so feel free to send those in. And I guess what we're starting to discover right now, Yanis, that particularly in the UK, or the US as well for that matter, and other countries, is that going into lockdown is much easier than coming out of it. And certainly here, the government has really changed its messaging in recent days. They don't want people to think that there's going to be a quick bounce back or a sudden recovery. They're trying to prepare people for a recession that could be quite prolonged and severe.
Indeed, because as I was saying before, we had a serious problem both in the United Kingdom and in the European Union, less so in the United States, before the coronavirus hit. We never before had such a very low level of investment compared to the amount of money around. So if you're in the developing country, you are somewhere in Africa and you have low levels of investment, that makes perfect sense because there is very little savings around, there is very little liquidity around. So of course there is very little investment. But when you've got economies like Europe's, including the United Kingdom, where in the last 10 years, we've pumped up such liquidity through central banks primarily, that we had the largest amount of savings in the history of Europe and the United Kingdom. Not amongst the small people, the little people, but overall. Corporations had savings, the 0.1% had savings. In some countries, even governments had savings or surpluses, like Germany was running a federal surplus. So when you have this much liquidity savings and you've got investment which is trailing, that was already creating a deflationary environment before the coronavirus hit. And the result of that was that you had lots of companies that were zombified. They were effectively connected to the European Central Bank, to the Bank of England, enjoying very low costs of rolling over their debts and surviving on this basis. The coronavirus has burst that bubble in the same way that in 2008, it was the bubble of the financial sector that was burst. Now we have the bubble of the whole corporate sector in the European Union and the United Kingdom being burst. So the reason why authorities quite rightly fear a very slow recovery is because a lot of those bubbles have burst and they cannot be reinflated. It's like a bicycle tire. If you've got 2 or 3 holes in it, it's very difficult to pump air into it.
So
even if you are pumping
the grants So despite the grants, the loans, the bailouts, the furlough scheme efforts to keep people on, there will be perhaps massive parts of industry and companies that simply don't make it through and they just disappear.
Exactly. Those which were surviving not on the basis of having invested in competitive goods and services, but that had survived on the basis of cheap credit from the financial markets. Those companies will find it very hard to be reinflated now that we're coming out of lockdown.
And so then I suppose that the question becomes how you try to open up the economy and also remove those stimulus measures that are currently in place, because if it all happens too quickly, you have a successive wave of infections and then a downturn that's even worse than before.
Well, I suspect that there are two things that need to happen. On the one hand, at the medical front, at the pandemic front, we need a lot more tests than we're doing. We need to get out of the blind quarantine into a much more targeted approach to isolation. The British government has been talking about 100,000 tests and so on, but the reality is underwhelming compared to the announcements from what my British friends tell me. Here in Greece, we don't test anyone, really. It's quite pathetic. The number of tests is minuscule. So that's at the medical front, in order to prevent, as you said, a new burgeoning of infections, especially in the autumn. At the economic level, what I think is absolutely important is that we move away from the bailouts, the purpose of which is, quite rightly so, in the first phase, to keep as many businesses going, from this blanket blind bailout to targeted public investment into the technologies that were necessary in any case, and which Britain and Europe were falling behind, particularly battery technologies, technologies concerning artificial intelligence, electrification, those technologies where Europe and the United Kingdom were falling seriously behind vis-a-vis, for instance, China.
A question here from Simon Harutunian about the debt burden in the UK specifically, but I suppose other developed countries are going to be facing the same problems. The scale of borrowing is unfathomable, isn't it? Public debt levels probably going to go in excess of, 100% of GDP. Who ends up paying for this?
Growth. Look, my answer to the question is stop worrying about public debt. Just stop worrying about it. It is not an issue. The issue is bankruptcies. Let me put it differently. If we are too worried about public debt now and apply austerity, that is, cut down on public spending in order to reduce the deficit, in order to manage the public debt, the result will be an exponential rise in bankruptcies. And then what will happen is, in the next year or two or three, the economic recovery is going to be non-existent because of this spate of bankruptcies. And then you're going to have a much greater public debt in 5 years' time. So think of public investment, smart public investment, large public investment today, which increases the debt, even if it increases largely, to a large extent. Think of it as an investment into reducing public debt in the future. The debt is never going to be repaid in the way that a household repays its debt.
But then how could it change in terms of policy? Would it be, is austerity out the question? Will it be through increases in taxation?
Oh, I hope there are neither increases in taxation nor austerity. Austerity is a terrible idea. Just, anybody who suggests austerity now is jeopardizing our collective future. Austerity never works. It never has worked, never will work. Think of poor George Osborne. He was chasing his tail like a maddened cat, trying to reduce the public sector borrowing requirement. And every time he tried to do that, growth fell and he had to borrow more money.
But isn't it more like the longer these measures are in place for, isn't that more likely?
No, not at all. These measures, as I said, we need to shift from a blanket bailout of everyone to targeted public investment where there are going to be good quality jobs created, so as to produce the incomes from which the nation's finances will be stabilized.
So if they're going to be grants and bailouts and financial assistance to companies, it should come with specific conditions attached to it.
Absolutely. So as I said, we should move beyond the blanket bailout where, we just try to lift all the boats at once, to more targeted public investments in the things that Britain needed anyway. Like, falling back in terms of battery technology. The future is going to be batteries, both in terms of renewable energies, electrification, cars, and so on and so forth. And Britain has had no serious investment in that region, in that area. Now I hear that there are plans to invest in that. Invest in that. That is, for instance, something that is going to pay back. And remember, after the Second World War, the debt to GDP ratio of the United Kingdom was 200%. Yeah, twice what it is now. Was it paid back? No, it was not paid back. The post-war recovery took care of that. The percentage of debt to GDP just collapsed as Britain grew out of the post-war misery.
Question here from Richard Reed, wanting to know your views, Yanis, on the response of the World Health Organization to the current crisis. I mean, they've come under a great deal of pressure, haven't they?
Yes, they have, and rightly so. We should be very critical of the World Health Organization, the same way that we should be very critical of the United Nations when it comes to peacekeeping around the world, the International Monetary Fund. We should be very critical of international organizations, but disbanding them and defunding them is not the answer. Improving them is the answer.
So a couple of more questions. First of all, what about, how concerned are you about permanent economic scarring? Obviously, you can get the economy going again. You can lift the restrictions on people's movements, but the thing that we don't know is how people's behavior is going to change once they've experienced life without the activities of, I don't know, bars, restaurants, concerts, the things that we were all used to. Will they want to go back to that?
I think we will. Let's not be too pessimistic about that. We are certainly, we are gregarious animals. We need each other. We need to be in the same space. We need to listen to music, watch plays, and all that is going to come back. But what is important is that those people who kept us alive during lockdown, who worked the supermarkets, the supply chains, and so on and so forth, that those people that everybody now is hailing as heroes, that they should not be left behind yet again, as they were left behind after 2008.
But I suppose what will restrict that is if we see mutations in the virus or repeated waves of infections. And of course, we live in a globalized world, so it's not just a question of what's happening inside your own country. You want to trade with other countries and boost your capacity and demand for your goods in that way. That will also be difficult because I suppose, you can't synchronize how this plays out in different parts of the world.
Yes, but you know what? Let's be hopeful. There will be a vaccine at some point. Even if there isn't, the disease is going to go away. Think of the Spanish flu in 1918. It was far worse than the coronavirus is. And we had anything between 50 and 100 million people who died, and we overcame it as humanity. We will overcome this one. But the most important thing is that we learn lessons from this lockdown and from this emergency. And the primary lesson that I think we as the West must learn is that normality pre-COVID-19 was not that good. We had a very rational way of distributing wealth, of using the powers of government, of keeping a balance between the world of money and the world of labor. And I would loathe the idea of going back to normality. That normality was a dystopia as far as I'm concerned, a very silly way of organizing economic life. So let's use this emergency as a wake-up call to improve and rebalance the world we live in.
A couple of other questions here. Andrei Filipov asking if you support the Rome Club's view that the existing economic model has to change. If so, how? I think you've sort of answered that question.
Absolutely. We certainly need to rebalance, as I said, the world of money and the world of real people. because there's such an incongruity between them. In the last 10 years after the 2008 crisis, as I said, we produced the largest amount of savings and liquidity and the lowest level of investment in relation to liquidity. That is not what a smart species does.
Now, there's also a question here about whether there should be a universal basic income. And we have seen an unprecedented state intervention in economies that we've really not seen before, and certainly with the furlough scheme here in the UK. And I suppose it'll be interesting to see if there is a sort of hangover from these policy innovations.
My quick answer is absolutely yes, but not funded through taxation. Because you can't go to a blue-collar worker and say part of your taxes are going to be used in order to give a certain amount of money to rich people or to people who are watching television all day just because they don't want to work. But the universal basic dividend that comes out of the returns to capital that is being produced socially must be established. And I think that also learning a lesson from Australia 2009, from Hong Kong a few months ago, at times of emergency, it is always a smart idea for the central bank of a nation, of a bloc like the Eurozone, to just credit bank accounts across, for every citizen, a certain amount of money in order to prevent a depression.
And just finally, maybe one last question. You were speaking about you're saying that you're quite hopeful despite everything that's happened, and you're saying about the importance of leadership. If we don't see real leadership, and not just unilaterally, but some sort of global coordination, structural solutions, how concerned are you about populism and social unrest? We've seen the rise in populism in recent years. Could we see this crisis give rise to new forces that could possibly be just as unpredictable and if not very damaging?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I'm not optimistic. I'm hopeful. I make a distinction between hope and optimism. There's no evidence that things are going to go well. But we have a moral duty, an ethical duty, if you want, to be hopeful and to work towards improvements. The rise of populism, I call it neo-fascism. I'm sorry, I use a harsher term. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Donald Trump, Modi in India, Le Pen in France, and so on and so forth. You know, they are this generation's fascists, racists, xenophobes. They are the product of 10 years of socialism for the very, very few and austerity for the very, very many. And if we continue like this, if we allow this crisis to go unexploited by progressives, if we waste it, in other words, then there's no doubt that this recalcitrant xenophobia is going to become politically triumphant. And we will only have ourselves to blame for that.
Optimistic, but well, actually, no, hopeful, but perhaps realistic, we could say. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and Yanis as well. Thanks very much for sharing your time. It was good to chat to you.